Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the foXnoMad podcast. I'm your host, foXnoMad Onol. I've got a great episode for you today. My guest is Valerie Stimac. She is the writer behind eatlikeBourdain.com. It is a website which catalogs over 1,500 places where Anthony Bourdain ate during his 20-year career. It's a fantastic resource. We talk about how she was able to compile all this information, the things you can find on the site, and what are some of the places that he's been to, and what the Bourdain effect has been on some of these restaurants. We get into all of that. I think you're going to love this episode. If you love food, if you love travel, you're going to really enjoy this episode with Valerie Stimac. Thanks, Valerie, for taking some time to talk to me on the podcast. Um, I wanted to talk to you because I came across your site multiple times on separate searches. So I would be traveling somewhere or maybe watching like Parts Unknown. Kind of part of my research when I go somewhere is like, yeah, where did Anthony Bourdain go? And then you see a place and you're like, oh, they didn't mention the name, which happens more frequently than I realized when you watch the show. They don't mention the name. And so when you're trying to find these places, it's really difficult. So your site has been a fantastic resource. How did you start compiling all of that information?
Yeah. So I will say, to kind of explain for listeners and for you why Parts Unknown is particularly difficult for locations. By then, Tony, I call him Tony, Tony had realized that he had a lot of impact on where people were choosing to travel. And they became a lot more discerning about naming places specifically because they knew that people like you and I would choose to visit those establishments. And that could obviously, as all travel does, have an impact on the place itself. So yeah, that's why Parts Unknown is particularly like that. If you go back into the earlier shows, he's much more liberal with naming and sharing the locations that he was visiting because he wanted them to have exposure. And then he realized that exposure is a double-edged sword. But going back to your question, which is why start the site? Very much the same reason as you. I love traveling. I love eating. I think food is an integral part of experiencing a place. And I have always admired Anthony Bourdain's general philosophies that he had about traveling and life. And so when I traveled, I would search for places that he had been, generally thinking like, we all look to some resource when we plan a trip. We look to people we trust. Who more would I trust than Anthony Bourdain to know where's good to eat? Because that was his area of expertise. And what I found is that the internet was rather limited on a really comprehensive database of everywhere. So you can find different shows have different levels of information. So like the Travel Channel, which was the network he worked with for No Reservations, they still have the website about no reservations, but it's really, really limited in terms of where he went, other than the general location. Parts Unknown, over the course of the show, they occasionally shared some of the places in some of the episodes, but it didn't share everywhere. So you might be watching an episode and then think, oh, when I go there, I want to go, to that place and not be able to figure out where it was. So I just decided I wanted to create the database of everywhere that we could possibly determine that Tony filmed specifically. And by we, I say we because I hired some writers to help me with the project. So most of it, more than half of it, I did, but I did have several other writers who helped. And that was great, especially as I worked in different regions that I'm not as familiar with. I'd have writers who were much more familiar with those regions and much better researchers, able to, watch something and do a little research on Google Maps to try and figure out the exact name of a place.
Wow. So it sounds like it's two ways of research, right? There's the kind of the obvious places, I would assume, but then, is it as detailed as trying to like find somebody from a region and look at a city and go, I recognize that corner or that street shop, and then trying to like Google Maps or maybe, send somebody who's there or something like that. How did the research look like?
Yeah, it kind of varied on how deep the research had to go. So sometimes they would say the name of a place, or they would have a splash screen about it. And so that's really easy, right? They give us the name. We just have to make sure we're picking the right name, and because sometimes there'll be more than one location or something. And then sometimes it would be they wouldn't say the name, but you could get enough context clues from the scene in the episode to determine where it was. So you might see the business next door to it and be like, well, it's in Barcelona, and this business, it's next to X business. So if I look at Google, that's easy to figure out maybe where that restaurant is, what exactly it's named. And sometimes it was as in-depth as not really having much in the way of context clues other than we know he ate X in Y and going into the rabbit hole. So TripAdvisor forums would occasionally reveal the names of locations. And then there's some places that increasingly this is not the case on the site, but there were some places I would just say unnamed carrito, unnamed street food stall. And readers have been filling in those gaps. So you'll find some posts where there were lots and lots of comments of someone saying, hey, I know Mexico City. I know this place that he never said the name. This is the place. Here's where it is. Here's the Google map link. So you can verify that that's the place I'm talking about and match it to where he showed on screen. So that kind of deep research was either we did that when we were watching, or sometimes we couldn't even do it ourselves. And a local or someone who had visited would fill in that gap once they found the guide by searching themselves.
And, what was the process like? Is it, you're doing this all at once? Did you say like, okay, I'm going to get 6 months and try to compile all this data? Or was it sort of something that evolved over many years?
It was all at once over many years. Yeah. So it took 2.5 years to watch all of the episodes. And that was with writers helping me. So sometimes, I had a writer who was doing Africa. He's doing all the African countries because the site is organized by destination. So that's why you'll find it if you're searching, where did Tony eat in London, or where did he go in West Virginia, or whatever. It would not necessarily be where did he eat in parts unknown. We don't really have a full list of all those places, but you could go by destination. So there'd be several of us working at the same time, but it took 2.5 years to write about 250 guides. So yeah, it was just, taking bite-sized chunks. I had some early success, which is a lot of the way people found me very early on, was that I wrote the Lisbon guide. And I wrote that because I loved Lisbon. I've been there myself, actually, just shortly after Bourdain visited, and I knew it was a great food city. I didn't realize that it is still considered one of the best food cities in Europe, because it's the early wins. So then what I did, and this is sort of a sort of funny way to do it, is I thought, like, where are all the related places? And I kind of worked out from there. So Lisbon, then it was like every other destination in Portugal, then Portugal as a whole, then the neighboring countries, and sort of moving out around the world from there until we had covered every single place that we knew he had been.
Wow. I mean, that
Yeah.
is so many places. When
Yeah.
you think about, I mean, even if you just focused on one of the shows, it would be a ton of information.
Yeah.
So, you know, it, you're compiling this information. Clearly, you're a Bourdain fan. I think many
Yeah.
travelers are.
Yeah.
People who like to eat are, and also, he goes to places that are unique, right? So you want to have that sort of feeling. Um, you know, what was something that you learned when you're trying to pull this information together?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Um, I think I learned a lot about Anthony Bourdain as a man over the course of watching his career. So it took him almost 20 years to make his entire catalog of TV before his death, from about 2001 to about 2018, because he was filming when he died. And we all changed a lot in 18 years. And watching him grow and develop and take on the weight of fame really provided me some context as a writer and as a person about what my goals were in life. So when I was young, as a side story, I wanted to be famous. That's what my mom said. What do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be famous. And what I really meant was I wanted to travel the world. I don't know quite how my brain had connected those two things, but I think I thought, movie stars are famous and they get to travel to film movies. So I want to be a movie star, AKA I want to be famous. And what I really, really brought home in watching all of his shows and watching him move through the weight of fame was that I didn't want to be famous. I think everybody would like that, especially in this social media world that we live in. But I personally don't want to be so well known that I can't go out to eat in my own hometown, and that I can't share the places I love for fear of, quote, ruining them. Now, we could get into a lot of details about how travel, ruins or doesn't ruin places with exposure, but I think he was very aware that his own travels had a huge impact. And I was personally very upset by where he chose to end his life. And you may want to have a content warning, obviously talking about Anthony Bourdain, it's hard not to talk about his death, but that region of France, I have been to that region. I love that region of France. It's my favorite part of France and part of Germany, really. That region kind of straddles the border. And I was so sad because I realized that people would never see it through his eyes because that episode and all that content would never be released. And that they would always, Bourdain fans would always just associate it with his death when that region is so special to me. And that really, again, brought home that he understood the responsibility he had as a traveler in media to protect, but also provide promotion to places he went. And it was a very, very tight rope, very, very fine line that he had to walk. And so I learned I don't want to get to his level. I'd love to help people travel more. I'd love to have the work I do help more people explore the world, but I don't want it to be the case that I have to worry about forever changing or ruining a place because I recommended it. I just want businesses to, succeed because I recommend them, not be, you can't get in anymore, which there were lots of places he went that you can't get into still to this day because there are so many people who want to go there. That's probably a little bit deeper than like the general travel lessons that most people get. But when you watched his entire career, that was kind of what you saw as an arc throughout his television work.
Interesting. Yeah, as you say that, I was recently in Vietnam, which for me, because of the connection to Anthony Bourdain, was a place that I wanted to leave as one of the last countries I visited. But circumstance had it, so I went. And there's a bún chao place in Hanoi, right? It's probably one of the most, if not the most famous place he's eaten since he ate there with Obama, I think in 2016 maybe, or something like that. Pretty iconic. I'm sure you know that they have the table in a glass container on the second floor. It's totally preserved. When you go there, it is very crowded. Typically, it is about 50-50 tourists with locals, I would say. But pretty much every local will tell you that the food there is not as good as it used to be. Now, I don't know if that is partially because people are paying attention more, or things have really changed, or it's just sort of this, people, when things get popular, there's always a group of people that go, nah, that place isn't as good. My place is the place I know is better. Um, but it's clearly changed the lives of the people who run that place. I mean, it's forever going to be this massive. So how do you think, how does that balance look like, do you think, for him, or the places that he's been? There are places that maybe he didn't mention on the show that would love that kind of business, right? Especially in smaller locations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. So I live in Cleveland, Ohio. Actually, it's fun when members of the Eat Like Bourdain community, I'm pretty chatty in my email. Like I send emails every week about new guides and Bourdain things. So I live in Cleveland. There's weirdly lots of us in Cleveland. And Cleveland is sad because Cleveland's restaurant scene looks a lot more traditional than most of the places that Bourdain went. So to explain, I know the total number of places that are listed on my website. It's about 1,500 places that we have cataloged into the site. And then every year I try and get every single guide checked. So we check every single one and make sure that the places are still open. And if they're not open, we make a note of that. So we include closed places in these guides because those places still were on screen and matter, even if you can't go to them today. Now, currently, of the entire database of places that Bourdain ate, about 85% of them are still open, which is pretty impressive considering how tough it is to run a restaurant anywhere in the world, how tough it is to stay open past a few years. So that's actually really good. And one might say that might be because of Bourdain visiting those places, more of them are able to stay open because they continue to get exposure. Cleveland is not like that. Cleveland, there were 6 places that he went, and only one of them is open today, and it's the public market that's been open for over 100 years. So that place is probably never going to close, or it's not going to close in my lifetime. But what's interesting is right across the street from the market, there's this incredible bar that when you walk in, you go, man, Tony would have loved this place. Now, the side story is that his on-screen local host, who I'm not going to go too deep into it. If you want to do the research, watch the episode. His on-screen local host and I are connected. We DM on Instagram, and I went to this bar for Bourdain Day because I know they make a good Negroni. And that was his favorite drink. So I'm there, I'm having a drink, and I kind of post on Instagram. And this on-screen local host messaged me and says, we went in there. Tony and I went there, and we didn't film there because he thought that all bars were too hard to film in because of the lighting. And as soon as we walked in, he said, "Oh, I wish we'd set up here because this is such a great spot." So literally within, a block of this place that's still open is this place that is also still open, and that he went and is not on screen. And I have not named it in the guide. It's on Instagram if you want to go check it out. It's where I had a Negroni for Bourdain Day this year. And so it's interesting to think about the Bourdain effect and how he did keep places open, and like how different would this great bar be? I mean, it's still open and didn't need Bourdain's exposure to stay open. And everybody in Cleveland knows it's one of the best cocktail bars in town. So they're probably not likely to close either. But a lot of places that I would expect to close that maybe aren't as good. And there's always going to be controversy among locals about like, well, why did he go there? He should have gone here. We're all like that about the places we know and love. I do the same thing in London, actually, because I used to live in London, and the places he went in London are great, but like there's so many other great places too. And so that it is kind of interesting to consider, how much of an impact he had, because it does seem that even now, 6 years after his death, 25 years after the start of his career, there is still this lingering effect that places that he named that people are still searching for and finding through my site and through the official, Parts Unknown website. Those places stay open, maybe in part because of what he did when he gave them exposure, which is why he was so careful about that in his later seasons, because he knew that that was going to happen, and he had to be very careful about where he went and where he named.
Yeah, it's sort of a weird thing with popularity with sites, tourist sites and restaurants. It's like the drug dealer effect, I call it. Like if you're selling illegal drugs, right, you kind of want everyone to know, but also nobody to know. And it's the same thing with like having like a good bar or a restaurant. You want it to be super popular, but there's something that happens. I think it's more of a perception thing, but there's something that happens when something hits like peak popularity and it loses some of the maybe the character or just something happens. And I don't, I guess if you run the business, that's what you want, right? Like ultimately you want your place to be very popular. But I can think of a couple of places off the top of my head that have had that kind of boom and they're just not as good. I
Yeah.
think there's a scalability issue there.
Yeah, and one could take this and extrapolate out in travel in general that, if you and I go a place because Bourdain went there, the place is inherently not the place he went, because he went before he went there, when it had its own, vibe or, atmosphere, whatever it might be for that location. And that's the same thing you could say for this bar in Cleveland, is I go there on Bourdain Day and I'm the only person in the bar, and I'm the only Bourdain fan. I mean, I think there were two other people in the bar, and there was funnily enough, some sort of lawyer happy hour going on in the back. Like it clearly not, it should be, but it is clearly not the place that people who are fans of Bourdain would congregate on Bourdain Day of all days, which is celebrated on his birthday. Um, but if everybody knew and everybody went there, would it still have the special magic that he experienced and that I got to experience because nobody knows about it? And I personally, I do not gatekeep locations when I travel, even in my own travels and the limited, range of influence I have in the other travel writing I do. I don't believe that I go anywhere that you couldn't find on Google with a bit of Googling and searching and researching. But I think that it was different when, especially later in Bourdain's life, that he did have a much bigger influence, and he definitely changed the places he went. So the great example is the trattoria in Rome that he went to with his girlfriend at the time, that he did not name. And it was a great mystery what the name of this is. Trattoria Settimio, I think is how you would pronounce it, which has just changed ownership and has a new name. Someone just gave me that information from Rome. He didn't name it because he didn't want to ruin it. But also, why can't we know it? It's not like that restaurant opened just for him to eat at, right? It was already there. And it's thankfully been able to change ownership and stay open and hopefully provide the same quality, but it undoubtedly changed because he went there. Even when he didn't name it, people still cared. So
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know that there's any real, winning that or finding that perfect balance.
Yeah, and maybe there's a part of him that wanted that place to be there for him when he went back. It's like some
Yeah.
place where it's like, hey, I just need my little favorite place. If I announce
Yeah.
all of my favorite places, I'm gonna go there and they're gonna be fans.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's kind of a nightmare, a blessing and a nightmare, right? Like some people
Yeah.
are probably really good and, but also sometimes you just want to have, have
Yeah.
dinner.
Yeah. And there are stories of that in some of the books that have come out posthumously about like he couldn't go out in New York City at all. He couldn't even walk down the street. And how frustrating you want to be, you are grateful, right? That people know and love your work, but also like I just want to go to the grocery store. I don't want to be accosted by fans and paparazzi every time I step outside my door. So yeah, it's a really tough one. And it's tough too for the place, similarly, the places you win get that same sort of get some of that sheen of fame and that may help the businesses, but it also changes them, just like it changed him.
It's kind of funny that as you would think like, okay, he's just going to these food places, but we get into the psychology of him. And I think it's because he was so like there was just a side of him that we felt very personable. Um, and but there is something like for fans to go to those places to find them, and then you feel like you're like, man, I don't know what that is, but there's some connection that you have. You're in this foreign place, but there's a sort of connection you have. Do you feel like that's changed now since he's passed away? I mean, has the Bourdain effect, I guess not for the restaurants, but maybe like for fans, has that changed? Is that changing?
That's an interesting question. I don't think that it is changing. I think that maybe early on it did. I think when in the first few years after his death, there was more of a like sanctity of, a holiness to visiting the places that he went. But I think that has toned down a bit. And I actually am glad that it has, right? Because I think he would have thought it's ridiculous that we were like holding him up in this great light, like he didn't have all the flaws that he shared with us to make him feel like he was such a really accessible human that we could, you know, empathize with when he traveled. I am one of the moderators on our Anthony Bourdain subreddit, and it's always delightful to see new people coming into the fold. That sub has grown a ton since I joined that team, and it's really great. You'll still see people like, oh, I just discovered Anthony Bourdain. Which book should I read first? Which show should I start with? And to watch the community of people who've been watching him, some since the very beginning on cable or network TV, engaging and growing and fostering the things that I think he actually stood for, which is an openness and willingness to try new things and um, uh, a sense of understanding that everyone who's human and has their flaws, and yet we should still respect and try and respect each other if we can. So I think the Bourdain effect is just as strong among the people. Like the community is still very active and engaged, which is delightful and obviously wonderful for my website because it means people keep traveling for that reason. But it's also, I think that's his legacy, is this community of people who try and embody what he wanted to embody and himself struggled to do at times. Like we're all human. He could never be this like perfect, open-minded, open-hearted traveler, but he wanted everyone to try and do that just like he was trying to do it. And people are still doing that, which is great.
And I think, what's fascinating about him is he had this evolution over his career. Like the show changed, he changed. Obviously, we as viewers change. I guess I feel like as an Anthony Bourdain expert here, I mean, you've seen the whole catalog of shows and books. Where do you think he might have gone creatively? If you were to just guess, or maybe just what would you have liked to have seen?
Great. Oof. This is an interesting question. I don't typically try and imagine the future for him. I think a
Mhm.
couple times that it does happen. I think he was nearing the end of his television career. Um, I think naturally. I think he was kind of feeling like he had really mastered the art of telling stories in that medium and would have only been beating a dead horse at a certain point and doing great work. But like for him as a fellow creative person, I can see that he was doing some incredible filmmaking, not TV making, filmmaking with his shows. And he would have looked for the next thing where he could stretch and grow into. I would have thought a podcast might have been a really interesting medium because he was a storyteller and he was an incredible speaker. Even, his shows are generally scripted, right? He would write a script, he would write a voiceover. But he was an incredible spontaneous speaker as well. So it would be really interesting if he interviewed fascinating people. You could imagine Bourdain doing like an armchair expert type of podcast, right? That'd be so cool. Um, the other thing I think that maybe he would have done is I think he would have really struggled in the United States in the past 8 years with all of the political baloney that we have been going through. I think he was already very much entrenched in the some of the big political movements in the country as a very engaged citizen. He, like we all should feel, was had a sense of responsibility to try and make the world better. We all can differ in our opinions of what that might look like, but he was engaged in the political discourse and machinery. So it would be very interesting to see how the last 8 years would have been for him as a human being with a large audience. I don't know if that would have been anything in a structured way. Like, he would have had a structured job where he was doing something like that. But there's lots of times, and you'll often see in the subreddit where they're like, oh, if Tony were alive today, what he would have to say about X. But yeah, I don't know. I think it would have been interesting because as he grew older too, right? He was in his 60s. He would have been looking for something different. We all go through phases of creation and the formats that takes in our lives and the work we're doing and the meaning it holds. And I think he was reaching the end of what television meant to him. And so I don't quite know what would have been next, but it would have been, I think, genuinely enjoyable to watch, even if he wasn't the best at it, right? He could have pulled a Michael Jordan going to baseball, but we would still have been fascinated and watched anyway.
Yeah, there's, like when I script my travel videos, the voiceovers, I always have him in the back of my mind because there's a efficiency with the words that are not only like, okay, this is the point of this sentence, but a feeling or something that will stick with like a description that will stick with you, I think is really good at that. And I think that's what gives that description character, but also him. It's just this feedback that you get. Oh, okay, I feel like this when I'm here, and you're with him for that ride. I think there's something about that way of storytelling that it is harder to find in shorter mediums, like
Mhm.
like a TikTok or something like that. It's
Yeah.
really difficult to sort of get that sense. But it would have been interesting to
Yeah.
see.
And it's
Mhm. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
it would also have been interesting to watch him in the pandemic, right? Because all of us in the travel sphere, we stopped traveling for some amount of time, and
Mhm.
presumably he would have too. And what would his creative energy, all that energy he brought, and all that passion and devotion to creating good things, what direction would that have gone? Because many of us pivoted, changed, we changed in that. We were changed by it. So it would have been interesting, he would have been presumably in New York City, and one of New York City's toughest couple of
Mhm.
years in its history. That would have changed him and what he was creating too. I don't think he would have become like a TikTok star. I just don't see that. I think he would have shaken his head in it. But you never know. I mean, maybe he would have found a way to do it meaningfully.
It's interesting, and even if he had just ended his career and just said, "Hey, I'm totally done with everything," what we have is such a fantastic resource, I think, both for storytelling, for entertainment, but also as a travel guide. So it's really, really incredibly useful and amazing that you've compiled all of this information. Like I said, it's something that I've gone back to multiple times. I should send a correction though. I did find a place that's close. I could not find it in Bhutan.
Okay, please. Yeah. The best way is to comment right on the guide. So if anyone's listening and you go read a guide and you say, nope, that place is definitely closed, just comment on that guide. I see all of that. And I go in and I verify. And then I will update the guide immediately, because as soon as I know something is closed, I don't want anyone else to plan to go somewhere and be disappointed to discover it's not open. I'd rather honor the place that was than have people be disappointed that it's not there anymore.
Cool. I will definitely, I'll definitely leave a comment. I was like, huh, but Bhutan is such a place where like they don't really have good addresses, sort of thing, and so I wasn't sure, but we searched around for a while, my guide and I. It was
And
kind of
I can
funny.
even add a note like that. I can even,
Yeah,
I sometimes do, people say, I don't think it's there anymore. I say, okay, well, closed question mark. If you're able to verify that it is open or closed, please let me know. And that at least lets people know if they do go looking and they can't find it, we kind of warned them, it might not be there anymore.
although I must say it ended up being one of my most memorable times in Bhutan because so my guide is like searching around. We're looking for this place, and it's just a description. It doesn't have an address, like a proper address, which is typical for this kind of hole in the wall type of place there. So, but we meet all these people who are coming out of their shops trying to help us find it. And we're like, it was just a really fantastic afternoon. It was so much fun. So the experience of trying to find the place ended up being sort of the memory I have from that day. Um, so it just, yeah, so it's often not the place, right? Like it's how did you get there?
Yeah.
What's the dumb thing that happened that you were like at the time stressed out about, but ended up being a funny story, that kind of stuff.
I think a lot about the horrible, like cheesy inspirational quotes that are true. And like it's the journey, not the destination, is the one that comes to mind as you tell me this story, which is true. And one would say that was part of what Tony was trying to show too, especially when he didn't tell us the name of a place. Like it's not about that specific place. It's about being and existing and exploring and experiencing Rome, not about the specific place that he ate. And so, yeah, maybe there's a big long line at the place that Bourdain went. Look around and see what else might be there, because there's probably somewhere great within close, or in Hanoi. Like there's plenty of incredible bun cha places. Sure, you can go to the one that Tony ate at, and I'd love to hear about that. Tell me in the comments. But you can also find awesome places too. In fact, that actually reminds me, I'm trying to work, and I have not been able to get the momentum to create a database of places. I'm calling it, in my mind, it's like places Tony would have loved. Like if we were
Mhm.
the location scouts, what are the places we know he would have enjoyed? Just as a secondary resource for people. So like, in Cleveland, there's hardly any places open anymore. Where would he have loved now, today, that we could point travelers to when they come to our city? These places are also great, or better maybe than the places that are currently open. I haven't quite figured out what that looks like on the website, because it's not really the way people come. That's not really what people come to the site for, but maybe someday, maybe it'll add that in as part of the offering for visitors.
Yeah, and you kind of bring something up. Is the site sort of like baked in the sense that is there ongoing research for new places, or are you sort of maintaining what you have? Where are you at now with the site?
Yeah. In my mind, the site is quote unquote done.
Hmm.
I set out what I meant to accomplish, which was to make the guide for every place. And now it is my responsibility to keep that site updated, so that it is available to anyone in the future who wants to visit those places. I have not figured out what to do next, but I feel okay with that, which is it's kind of interesting to reach that point creatively, I think. And maybe you have this with the podcast or with YouTube. It's like you just keep going on this hamster wheel of creation, because you can't. I could keep going. I could write guides to places he didn't go with recommendations from where people think he would have liked. Uh, but I had a very discrete goal in my mind, and I accomplished that. So at this point, I'm sort of in a holding pattern and keeping it updated, but I don't know if it will ever develop into anything else. I had a great podcast idea, but I couldn't figure out the finances, because my idea was so grand that it did. I've had 3 podcast ideas. None of them have ever taken off, and that's okay. I'm still playing with it in my mind. For now, it is what it is, and I'm happy to connect with anybody who finds it interesting. And if anyone has a great idea, I'm also happy to chat about ways it could develop into something else.
Yeah, I think a book would be great
I've
of
heard
the
that a lot.
places. I,
Hmm.
I think that would be fantastic because that's how I use your site. I literally, I'm going somewhere. I'm like, hey, let me watch the episode if there is one, because also it gives you context, right? When you're watching the show, it's not just like an encyclopedia. It's like, what do the streets look like? What's the vibe, right? Like, what am I? Well, how do I
Hmm.
want to feel? What are some things that ideas I might get on my own? But then I'll go look like, oh, that place looks like good. Those are good starting places to eat. That place, this place, maybe, and then kind of branch out from there. So, um, but your site is there, which is fantastic, and I love that the comments are sort of a living place where you can get updates and sort of see how things are going. Um, I guess sort of as we wrap things up, I have a couple of questions. I think the first would be for someone who does not really know Anthony Bourdain or maybe has not cared to watch. If you were going to give them an elevator pitch of this is why you should eat at a place he's been to or drink at a place he's been to, what would that be? Other than he's famous, you know?
Yeah. Well, it would sort of depend. If you are a person who loves food, it is safe to say that chefs are the most discerning when it comes to where good places will be. And that doesn't necessarily mean the highest quality and fanciest food. It means places that embody a sense of the environment and the ingredients and the flavors and cultures in that food. And that can be cheap street food, that can be pub food in the UK, that can be white tablecloths and incredible, it can range, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you're spending a lot of money. Tony, as a chef, as a cook, had a very good sense of that. And he was friends with some really good people. I think that's what you also pick up on when you watch as many episodes as I've seen, is that he was often just a passenger. It was the local guides who really revealed the place to him. And those people, absolutely, you should trust them because that's like having a local friend. So if Tony needs to be the proxy for the local friend that you don't have in a location, he's a great one because he was often being informed by much, much better guides to that place than even he could ever be. Yeah, it's not really about him being famous. It's about him liking good food and having great friends that showed him good places and then using him as that gateway for yourself.
And now for the ultra fan, the people who I don't know if I'd consider myself an ultra fan, but I think I've seen pretty much everything he's done. Like like interviews, every episode. I've read all the books. For somebody like that who's like thinking, how do you carry on, like find your own place to go in a city? Like what do you think, what sort of nugget would you say, like that's something to look for, right? Like that's a way to get sort of that local feel when you might just show up in a place and have really no idea what to do.
Yeah, I think there's a couple guides that I will tend to use. One is I'm certainly the kind of person that I use, and I apologize, my lawn mowers are here. If you hear that in the
Yep.
background. Um, so I will absolutely use other guides. So the Michelin Guide, James Beard nominations. If you're looking for really, really great food, those are excellent ways to just sort of get your feet on the ground about what places are notable. The other one is asking the bellhops, asking the valet drivers, asking the bartenders, the chefs, where are they eating? Because if they're spending their money to eat somewhere, it's probably going to be pretty good, even if it's not the greatest food that you can find there. If you think about it, people who work in the food service industry, many of them are operating, living on tips. They have very low hourly wages. If they're spending money on food out, if they're not cooking their own thing, where are they going? Where they're going is probably going to be a fun time, even if it's not the best food. So great example I have that my husband found at one point in Vegas. There's a tiki bar called the Golden Tiki. Tony didn't go there. When you walk in, you're like, he would have loved it, first of all. So now I know I'm in the right place. And it's where the chefs and the bartenders are known to go after their shifts end. So it's going to be a good time, even if it's not the best food. I hope that is sort of a helpful guide. But I'm also like, I save up and go to those bucket list places that he went. Like I've been to Noma, which was insanely expensive and insanely incredible. And I'm glad I got to do it one time. So I don't think I'll ever eat at all 1,500 places or even 150 places that he ate.
Do you have any travel goals specifically? Like you mentioned, I mean, obviously not trying to eat at all the places, but I have a feeling that you might be, like you might be the kind of person that will set a travel goal. I wonder if you have one, uh, whether it's Bourdain related or not going forward. Is it visiting every, you know, country or capital city or something like that?
Yeah, I don't have a number goal. So I don't have a number goal per se. I have always had, I call them a top three, three countries that are sitting right at the top of my list. And I am in my whole life since I was a kid, I've always had that. And so and the list has shifted, but it's actually been pretty stable for a while now. So my top three currently are New Zealand, Japan, and Egypt. And I would go to those places because I want to go there. And then I would reference my guide, the guides that we have for those places to supplement the experiences I want to have there. So I don't say I'm going to a place, I'm only going to eat at the places that Bourdain ate. I use it as a complement to my own interests in a destination, and use it to make sure I get a couple good meals. So I went to London in summer 2023, and I was heavy in using the Bourdain guide. I did 2 or 3 days where that was all I was doing, was everywhere he ate. And then the rest of the time I just ate where I wanted to eat, that I knew that I loved, or new places that I'd found, because you can never replicate the magic that Tony brought to a place when he was alive and working, but you can replicate the spirit in your own travels. So yeah, no specific like number goal, but definitely places that are literally the top of my list. And if I went to Japan, of course I'm going to use, the list of places he ate in Tokyo. Like, first of all, that in Japan in particular, I might like need some guidance, right? There's so many incredible places to eat, and also I'm kind of scared of what I might find. So I'll stick to the places that he went that I
Yeah.
think are going to be safe. Maybe they won't, maybe they'll be experimental, but yeah. Yeah, that's good. I don't really have like a tick off the list other than places I just want to get to someday.
This has been such an awesome conversation. I really like that the person behind the site is just such a Bourdain fan. I love that. Part of me, I'm like, because when I'm looking for something, I'm like, where did Bourdain eat here or there? I'm like, how many people could be as interested in that as me? I always think about that with everything that, with me, but I'm like, oh, there's a whole site dedicated to this. And you're such a Bourdain fan. It's just been really like awesome. It's been
Thank
really
you.
fun to talk about these places. And like I said, try to find them. I
Thank you.
really had a blast trying to
All right. Well,
find
thank you
those
so
in
much for
Japan.
having me.
And where are all the places people can find you, just so they can check out
Sure.
the site.
So I have lots of projects. Once you find one of my projects, if you search my name, which is Valerie Stimac, you will find all the others. So we'll just focus on the Bourdain project. So you can find me, it's eatlikebourdain.com, and it's at eatlikebourdain on Instagram. You can also come hang out in the subreddit. It's r/Anthony Bourdain. There's no promotion of the site over there. I'm very firm on the subreddit rules of like no promotion. So you won't find the site, at least you won't find it from me. Sometimes people share my guides over there, and I love that because that means it's working out into the community. Yeah, those three areas are where I'm kind of hanging out on all things Bourdain. And then if you want to connect with me, I can point you in other directions. Like, I have a site about London, and I have a website that's like the American West and Alaska, which is where I grew up, place I wish Tony had really gone. That list is endless of places I wish he had gone. So I'm all over the internet, but at Eat Like Bourdain or eatlikebourdain.com are the main two.
Awesome. I will leave those links all in the show notes so people
Thank
can
you.
find you. And I'll be in touch. I'll be in the comments, in these random smaller places to find. Although I will
Perfect.
say the Buncha experience for me was pretty awesome. I just being there
Yeah.
I was just like, this is pretty cool.
There's a
So
little magic in the air in the places that he went. I can't, and I'm not saying don't go to those places too. Please support those businesses, but also support other businesses when you're traveling.
awesome. Well, thanks again for your time. Everybody check out the links in the show notes, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks, Valerie, for being a guest on the podcast, and thank all of you for listening. Make sure you give this episode a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons down below. I'll have new episodes for you coming up very soon. Thank you again for watching. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.